Hello, thank you for inviting. Um, I will show you a brief example or try to get you through a project that's on topic like how to get from bread to neuroscience and what role speculation takes in this. And at the end of my project or of the description of my project, I will tell you some theoretical background how I or we try to work. In 2023, we represented Austria at the London Design Biennale with a project or an installation on the complexity of bread. That sounds at the beginning quite hands-on and quite classical. But a big part of our project were actually like objects that appeared at the beginning quite neutral and then were rather confusing people. Like you see here, the tools using for the bread somehow on the second view looked a bit unnormal. Then there was like this small things that looked like vinyl players, but with a bread in it, and you could actually put the headphones on and listen to different crusts of bread. Then there were the sculptural objects that were representing microbial reactions or different other 3D printed objects that could often not be identified at first glance, but later with some explanation and some tryouts were actually could be used by the visitors and led to multisensorial experience of the whole installation. And I will explain you now how do I get there and what is actually important and why do I do this. So my background is actually in classical way product and architectural design. We started basically with or our first project in this topic of kitchen was in 2010 when we designed a mobile kitchen that traveled Europe and parts of the US, and we were inviting strangers to dine with us. And besides that, our studio is working in classical interior design and object design, mainly for cultural institutions and museums. Like this is like Bundeskunsthalle Bonn, this big exhibition in the MKG. But what really drives me is often the question or the claim that the kitchen disappears. And I ask myself, why does it disappear? For me, cooking is something very important, something driving since more than a decade my work. And I get very inspired by the anthropologist Richard Wrangham, who formulated the cooking hypothesis, and he argues that cooking food played a central role in human evolution, like from the social aspects to developing language, to developing hierarchy, architecture, and so on. Just like get briefly into it. Well, sorry, I got lost. So the question that I asked often is, why should we cook in a time when we can get like in urban areas often like faster and cheaper fed with a kebab or something else or at a cheap Thai place than sitting at home buying ingredients, cooking for a long time, thinking of what we cook and so on. And the question is how we cook. There's an interesting claim by Kate Gibbs, who comes from a tradition of cookbooks, says that the point of cookbooks is hope, love, and beauty, but not cooking. And in average, only 1.2 recipes of each cookbooks are actually cooked. So I asked myself in one project, what would be actually the better cookbook? How can we get to this result? And what does it mean actually for contemporary humans to cook? So I wanted to show also an image and a paper that had its roots also in the BOL or in the Design Research Lab. It's a picture of from 2 years ago when Charles Spence from the University of Oxford visited Berlin, and we did work on 2 peer-reviewed papers on the sensuality of bread. That was very interesting because here, like my work that I would more describe as a perhaps social happening and workshop, and a very hands-on design approach was somehow combined with classical research, yes, with a psychologist that actually records everything and makes a research paper out of it. We tried to set the base for the therapeutic aspect of cooking, and not only as we say, okay, cooking is good or bread making is good for our mental health and for our physical health, but we wanted to make a foundation. And the psychological part was only a small part of the whole idea what we wanted to get into it. Big part for me was also visually the aspect of microbial reactions, and to kind of get into the whole complexity of bread that is somehow the foundation of our culture. And then in our everyday life, something very banal, something that you buy in foil in the supermarket, that is cheap, that nobody actually cares about. And how can we find in this staple food basically beauty and inspiration for a kind of design practice of tomorrow also? So for me, the basic approach was to, as also from the psychological aspect, was the multisensorial experience. So the aesthetic, smell, the taste, the sound, and the haptics of food or of bread, and combining this kind of mental aspect, psychological aspect, with physical aspects and physical health, and look into how the microbial world actually connects it. What we did then was, when we had some scientific foundation, we started to speculate, and we created something that is that I would say is already a classical methodology based on the methods of Dunn and Raby. We created 3 speculative worlds, 3 scenarios that kind of deal with societies based on bread. They are not any future predictions. They are just like alternative realities. So we have one society that is called the bakers and gardeners. It is a technologically critical society in a world affected by climate change and pollution. They see the only way to restore balance in the world is in gathering the ingredients for their bread. They have a very cultural pessimistic view and believe that the root of all our problems started with agriculture and the development of a gender system, strong hierarchies, and capitalism. To these societies, we have complete stories, more drawings, objects. We have designed their holidays. We have designed their standard breads, their process characteristics, their approach to ecology, and so on. And we have another society that is called the Brotonists. And the Brotonists are a quite somewhat conservative baking society that has a cult-like reverence for bread and the process of baking. Once a week, everybody lines up in front of the main building where the ingredients rice, spelt, emmer, wheat, water, and salt are distributed. Each person receives the same ingredients. Nevertheless, the society is strongly characterized by hierarchies due to the differences in the microbiome of the people baking. Different breads are produced with the same ingredients. Even if this can be influenced by therapies, these people are less respected and get worse jobs or cannot afford an own oven. So we take in here what you see also different theories or papers that are based on different technologies or of microbial coexistence in food. Yes, so for example, many of these part of these societies are based, for example, on paper of Robdan and Madden that claimed that actually we and our own microbiome have an influence on the fermentation process of bread, but also but also the fermentation, the fermented product, like the sourdough, can have an influence on our skin. Meaning, me giving my Žarko baking with it regularly, you will get a part of my microbiome and will actually have your microbiome changed. You can do biohacking by cooking in some kind of way. What interested me very much. And this led to another society that is called the Cyber Yeast Society. Yes, a society of hedonistic loners. However, they meet once a day as a group in the Dough and Sweat Center. Here they do fitness while they work on dough in the sense of multisensory experience. And they strive for physical and mental perfection. The time they spend changing clothes after training, showering, and performing the prescribed sexual intercourse, partners are chosen according to the results of a genetic sequencing of their microbiome, is enough to ferment and bake the enzymatically modified dough. This society also have, depending on their societal levels and skills, they have different drugs in their breads. Besides that, we discussed, for example, with yeast geneticists, different forms of possible future genetic modification or fermenting of microplastics and so on. I will and cannot tell you like the whole story, but just to have a glimpse of the idea how we're working. So we're not just like trying to make some fiction, but really talk to scientists and people to kind of make a proof of concept if our scenarios could somehow exist in an alternative reality. And out of these scenarios, and this is like a big difference to, I would say, classical speculative design, like, for example, Dan Arabi, that I will explain later, are working with impossible objects. Yes, they are interested in designing things that are not possible to make, that kind of challenge also our thinking and provoke the logic of our thinking. I would say that that's like rather in following the very abstract theory of Meillassoux, perhaps. And Superflux, for example, tries often to represent or illustrate different things, making illustrations and materialize objects in a provoking way, and also in a, I would say, often multisensory experience. What for me, coming like from classical product design and architecture, is interesting is realizing these objects that kind of are a mix of speculation and hands-on maker culture, and trying to bring them together and realizing them often, although I don't always believe and very often don't believe that it makes sense. Yes, I would not like to have this wearable that I will now show you and explain to you produced millions of time and having it in the world, but still it is interesting as a platform to think, to develop, and as we will see at the end, even bring it partly to the real world. So you remember I told you that we thought it's interesting to redesign the way we learn cooking. And one of the first things that came to my mind is you probably know the Pixar movie Ratatouille, like where Linguini, the chef that doesn't know anything, has this rat on his head and it's pulling the hair, and then he suddenly learns to cook. So I thought, could I build something like this rat, but that communicates in a more intimate way? Because I thought that the problem of learning to cook is not even the book, but it's perhaps language in general. Thought that cooking is something so sensual and often intimate that just by reading a text or letting explain somebody to you something, you will not probably learn it. So I thought, can I have a guiding hand, for example, that responds somehow to what is happening actually in my brain? So I made this small comic and I thought, okay, I want to measure like what is happening in my brain, and I want to have something on my hand that is like, controlling me or helping me to improve my technique or something like this. I had for this project, I had a big speculative or long speculative essay on about 20 pages that tried to bring together research on this topic and was not really scientific, but had a certain scientific approach, I would say. And I took out from this essay that went very far. I took out some aspects that actually helped me to realize something and build something. So the first study we took with just pens in the ball, we continued and repeated, but with having EEG, EKG, and motion tracking and an accelerator, meaning people that were working with DOE got tracked like their electrical activity on different parts of the body, plus tracking the motion and the acceleration of the hand. By this, we got some data that we could compare and put together with the psychological data that we had before from the first peer-reviewed studies. And then we could classify the data. We used a very easy emotional model that is surely also criticized in the context of neurodiversity, but for this project, it just made sense to start very easy. We could like track down or try to interpret mood emotion into tense, happy, sad, relaxed, the effort people were doing, and the speeds. And then we could make out of this a very simple if-then model. Yes, if you're sad and you're doing something too fast, then something has to happen. From this, we went into other studies that are based on research from the MIT and Oxford on haptic inputs. Basically, all these studies were made around 2015-16. There was a certain also a strong art movement that kind of calmed down. Today, only like I would say that only people working in VR are interested in this kind of haptic languages, but also in a very basic way. And the other industry that is strongly interested in it is actually the automotive industry. Yes, for warning signals and so on. But all of these are using at the moment very basic, also in the smartphone, very basic haptic or tactile triggers. We saw that by calibrating proper LRA motors, you can receive really interesting so-called haptic illusions or haptic hallucinations. Yes, just by like putting tap, tap, tap in a certain amplitude and speed, it can feel like a gentle stroke on your hand, or you can have a nervous tapping, or you have like soothing effects and so on. So you can not initiate a movement, but when you're moving your hand in a certain way, yes, by these haptic effects, you can help to modify this movement, make a rotation like smoother, slower, faster, and so on. And you will not actively feel that something is happening, because these effects are perceived by your brain, but not consciously understood or felt like by us. So the vibration actually is quite on a low level, but still will have influence on your movement. So we went through this whole process. We wrote the code. We 3D scanned heads and looked how we can actually redesign all the stuff that is used in neuroscience and bring it to a kind of maker culture level. And this was the result. We did like actually a set for sensor technology and interpretation, working with dry electrodes, having a wearable that is connecting and interpreting sensor data and giving live feedback. Besides that, what was interesting, there are also some very classical design issues we dealt with, meaning using monomaterials, partly recyclable materials, not using any gluing patches like classically, but using different forms of dry electrodes, different springs, having a tool that is recyclable perfectly and also repairable. The moment we're trying to further develop it in code, but also in hardware, and perhaps hopefully make an open source project or open source platform out of it for neuroscience in future. So this is me. And as I said, this aesthetic is nothing that we think that makes like really sense or having a product like this. We just thought that for this project, this a bit funny aesthetic is something that represents in a visual language what we want to say. So the use and potential of this is actually, besides having it in museums or like me talking about it, is actually that I'm also working with neuroscientists and psychiatrists on this topic, meaning we want to try this thing and will also try it out with people that suffer from different anxiety disorders, and we see if there is really potential for medical treatment in an approach like this. And on the other hand, we're further developing it in a design and cultural point of view, making like from musical data or drawing data, tactile patterns or other things, so that we don't have to code everything from scratch always, but trying to redesign the way we're thinking of tactile input. I will just go through quickly before I make a short theoretical input. I will show you quickly two other installations that we did that are important for this work. Like, as I told you before, we can modulate with sourdough, for example, other fermented foods, our microbiome. So I created some years ago the term of sourdough cyborg, as I was so fascinated by this idea. And we had the chance to realize an installation in an old car factory, or if in a part of a car factory that is still existing. And basically we put something like bakery inside, where in 3 months, 2,500 people from the management and from the white collar workers were walking through this installation and had to take care of my sourdough and had to get intimate with my sourdough and follow only video instructions of how to work with it. And after working and preparing the dough for the people coming in 24 hours, they needed to clean up, to prepare the workstation and leave the room. So we kind of took the logic of the production of cars and the very, very organized way to try to transfer it on microbial living. And also we analyzed how much the microorganisms in my sourdough would change by being touched by 2,500 other people, meaning I did the genetic sequencing of my sourdough before and later. And funnily, the concentration changed, and some microorganisms that are responsible for defending the microorganisms from being like kind of invaded, got stronger and more in population, for example. But the main thing was like for me, the kind of fight and discussion in design of like chemical and physical engineering to a world of understanding biology more. And I told you about this essay that also led to the project about neuroscience. And I told you before of Wrangham, who claimed, who made the term of the cooking ape, like the human as a cooking ape in anthropological understanding. Another form of how we perhaps translate theory in objects is like visualizing microbiology and building kitchens that are in some kind of way perhaps looking funny, and having like here something like a solar oven, having like balloons full of different microorganisms that can be squeezed into other fluids or sourdoughs, and working actively like procedures on the reinvention perhaps of flat surfaces, getting them more organic, or getting rid of much electricity, like you don't see it so well in this image. Here you see it. So having different, like getting different tools that normally are electrical, more again into a mechanical understanding of the kitchen and of design, to be nearer to the physical activity of what we are doing. And here I stop my presentation and will just like tell you what is for me important or interesting in design, and why I think that speculation, in my understanding, has an important role in today's design. So when we talk about speculation, very often we talk directly about a speculative realism that is developed, I would say, by Quentin Meillassoux and Armen Avanesian. And Meillassoux breaks free from human-centered thinking. He insists we can think about reality independent of human consciousness, meaning we can and should also think, for example, about a stone that is 2 billion years old, and try to think about what it really is and not what it seems to be, meaning in contrary to the philosophical tradition based on Kant, because Kant was always like discussing only things that are like relevant to human perception. So we want to discuss a world of thoughts that is irrelevant of our existence. And Meillassoux claims that the only thing that is sure is that nothing is sure. For him, it would be also plausible that, for example, the sun won't shine anymore tomorrow without a reason, and we could predict or understand it. As reasons or rules in his understanding could also change without a reason, paradoxically. And Avanesian, who kind of follows Meillassoux but turns it to a more pragmatic way, he pushes this further into temporal acceleration, arguing that futures already shape our present before we conceptually grasp them. Although rooted in the same field, his understanding is much more based on a theory of algorithmic complexity, I would say, meaning that algorithms make today decisions about our life before we actually understand how they really work. The future overtakes the present in his understanding. He believes we need to change our thinking from the base of human experience to a processual thinking that is being often faster than classical human understanding. And this is for me very, very important. So I want to underline this, that he's saying like that we want to get to a processual thinking instead of understanding real objects or new technologies completely. And speculative design can be seen as a creative parallel to these philosophical movements. When we look at Dunn and Raby and Superflux that I mentioned before, They translate speculation from abstract thought into tangible artifacts. They create what-if objects, prototype of alternative realities, possible or probable futures. And the idea is to use design as a medium to materialize provocations that make us question our assumptions about technology, society, and everyday life. In my understanding, or like this only a personal opinion, a crucial shift could be happening in the sense of the renaissance of maker culture. Yes, I would say that we had a peak of maker culture like in around 2014 to 2016 with all the Arduino things and so on. And our reality often seems more absurd than we could imagine. So speculative objects become working prototypes, functional experiments, things you can actually use and test. And to the speed of technological development, not being necessary or even possible to analyze their necessity or questioning their place in our real world. So the return to the practical resonates deeply, again, in my understanding, not in the understanding of Avanesyan and Meyasu, with a counter movement to a strongly digitized everyday life. Paradoxically, using basic and accessible code and microcontrollers, mixing it with traditional crafts and putting these with the historical distance, with also on digital technologies on the same level. So we see this, for example, with 3D printers. Yes, when I have built my 3D printers 2009, 2010 on my own, and it was like a hard thing. Today with Bamboo, you're just printing things from printables and so on. It's not how it got predicted in the maker culture, but still the move is like in a bit more than a decade, extremely big. And I think what is interesting is when we combine this kind of technologic and futuristic approach to a completely different movement in philosophy, meaning Lisa Heldke's feminist philosophy of cooking and craft. And this can be seen as a turning point in thinking and counter movement to intellectualized theory and elitarian new technologies. Heldke challenges philosophy's traditional hierarchy that places abstract theory above embodied practice. Yes, intellectually, always everything that is theoretical or permanent, also like a peer-reviewed paper, is always taken like higher in hierarchy than something like food that is eaten and is then away. Knowing that above knowing how, she says. She argues that activities like cooking aren't mere applications of knowledge, they are knowledge production itself. The baker understands fermentation not despite, but through the tactile, temporal, sensory engagement with dough. I would like to understand the process of design in a similar way like she understands cooking and craft. Speculative realism liberates thought from human-centeredness based on that. Speculative design or speculative thinking in design, as Dana Raby preferred to say, materializes these thoughts into objects, where maker culture liberates and tries to democratize knowledge of old and new technologies in a counter-tech cultural approach. And in these design and maker approaches, practice has been validated as genuine knowledge making, not secondary to theory, but equal to it, or even primary, if you wish so. And that's what, in my understanding, like connects speculation and making, and can also change this discipline or the design discipline in our thinking and understanding. So thank you. I think I'm pretty much in time. I hope I didn't rush too much.